And so the reason this is interesting to us in particular is we've got some previous work that showed that, that if you made up a force field that was a positive combination of position and velocity, that this force field was particularly easy to learn, where we're naturally really good at it, compared to, say, a pure position force field or a pure velocity force field or whatever. So I'll show the data from that. And so if you look and see how well subjects learn different types of force fields, so there's a velocity-dependent force field, a position-dependent force field, a positive combination of position and velocity, or a negative combination. By negative combination, I mean sort of the signs of the position and velocity-dependent components are opposite one another, or sort of the same. Right? What you see is that the single trial learning rate, right, is highest for a positive combination and lowest for a negative combination, and somewhat intermediate for the pure force field, the pure velocity or pure position. Right? And if we look at, remember, this positive combination resembled, right, the first principal component of the variance. So it was sort of like the largest component of the variance. And so we see like a very similar relationship in the variance accounted for by these different shapes. Right? So if we plot these against one another, there's a really sort of high correlation between the fraction of variance accounted for by each of these four types of shapes, the orange one, the green, the blue, and the red, right? And how easy it is to learn a force field, right? The learning rate associated with the force field that when you gave a force that was one of those factors, right? So it seems like there's a relationship between the sort of the shape, the temporal structure of the variability, right, and the learning rate. And so the last thing we wanted to do was say, well, that if indeed there is a relationship between variability in performance and the ability to learn, so high variability leads to better ability to learn, then is it possible that the motor system sort of and somehow intrinsically knows about this and then it takes advantage of it, right? And so the idea here is that if you're given something to learn sort of over and over and over again, a particular force field, right, then it would be good if a certain force field is turned on and then off and then on and off, so it sort of rapidly switches. So it's on here for 7 trials and off for 10 to 14, and on for 7 again, and off. And you do this whole thing for 50 trials of repeats, right? And you're constantly sort of asked to switch between these. And your motor system might recognize that it would be good to sort of really learn to sort of switch between these two things rapidly, right? And but maybe it's not able to by itself generate this sort of fast learning. And so how could it do that? Well, if higher variability led to faster learning, the motor system might be able to accomplish that if it was able to regulate the amount of variability in the action and make and specifically grow the type of variability that's associated with this type of learning. And so what we did is look at this paradigm and look and see first if subjects were able to actually learn faster at the end versus the beginning. And so that's what we saw. So we did 2 of these paradigms. One where when we gave subjects a position-dependent force field, shown as the left panel, and another one where we did the same paradigm before, where the force field training was always for a velocity-dependent force field, shown as the second panel. And let's just summarize data. The position-dependent component of the learning, right, after adaptation, right, at the end of the training, shown as solid, and at the beginning of the training, shown with the dash. So during the early exposure, the learning was shown by this dash line really small, and late in the learning, it was like 3-fold higher, 4-fold higher. And for the velocity one, you can see is the learning rate also where the learning initially was small, and late on it was higher. Okay, so people were able to increase the rate at which they learned from the beginning to the end, right? But wanted to look and see, does that also come with a change in variability, right? And so if instead of looking at the amount of learning, if we look at the variability in the force, and so the way we're going to do this is by measuring the force in the baseline period before you're exposed to this switching force field, right? And then long after learning the switching force field is washed out, so a long washout period at the end, and then look at the variability after this thing is all done, right? And what you see is that the variability that is aligned with position, shown in blue, right, increases from the beginning to the end by a factor by about 80 or 90%, right, almost doubling. But the variability associated with velocity, which is there in the baseline for all of the subjects, doesn't change at all. In fact, it goes down just a hair, but really it doesn't change, right? And the opposite thing goes on when subjects were exposed to velocity-dependent learning, right? And so here, the velocity-dependent component of the variability increases by almost a factor of 2, and the position-dependent component of the variability stays exactly the same, right? And so the idea is that subjects are not only able to sort of regulate the variability in their emotions. This is, of course, all involuntary. They don't realize that they're more variable in a very particular manner here, right? But they're able to, regulate the temporal structure of this variability, right? In a way that would lead to faster learning. Okay. Let me see a little bit where it's at. We'll just stop there. Okay.
Anybody else has a burning question?
I'll ask one. Now, I think your study all based on the human's physical aspects.
Yeah.
Did you correlate this thing with the neurological thingamagics of the brain or the biological?
Oh, right. Right. So, I mean, of course, all this stuff I talked about was in healthy subjects. We do some subjects, some studies in my lab with certain neurological diseases, but I didn't show you that here. And so, there's no sort of neurologic impairment in these people. Certainly nothing that's gross. No, we didn't do any imaging of subjects, right, or other sorts of other sorts of. So then, of course, we look specifically, right, at variations, one of the variability, right. There has been, so the stuff that we showed here in terms of the variability affecting learning, it's the first time people have been able to sort of look at some aspect of the baseline performance of the task, right, and predict learning ability. People have previously looked at sort of imaging correlates for better performance, right, and genetic correlates. So it turns out to be that there are a couple of genes, BDNF is one of them, brain derived neurotransmitter factor, that are really heterogeneous across the population. So that in the room, that probably 40% of people have one sort of type allele for this, and 60% have a different type. And so that really show differences in motor ability. They're relatively mild, but it depends on the task, maybe 10 or 20% differences. But that's just from a single gene effect. And then it turns out that there are differences in motor learning ability that go with what's called sort of white matter development. Right? So if you scan someone's brain, roughly speaking, you can divide sort of this neural tissue into gray matter and white matter. So gray matter are areas of the brain where they're mostly sort of neurons, or cell bodies of neurons. And the white matter is where the axon neurons are running in bundles and glued together. So the insulation on the axon is called myelin, and it's fat basically, and it comes out as white on the skin, so it's called white matter. And so people have better white matter development, right? Even among normal levels, right? So if you took this room and classified it into people who have slightly higher white matter development than others, and that does correlate with motor learning on early learning on novel tasks.
What about what was the age or gender variance of your test matters?
Oh,
subjects?
So yeah, I mean, we're at a university campus, and so for our, for these kinds of basic studies, we just sort of, take whoever comes in the door, which tends to be people from 18 to 20-something years of age.
And
Because
probably
they're undergraduates and
above
graduates.
average IQs or rich,
I mean, they're Harvard students, so, yes.
both applies.
Both applies.
Thanks.
I mean, the richest people probably don't come in to get $15 an hour for experiments like that, right? So,
No, they might, I mean, it depends on.
sure, but not as much.
Yeah,
probably.
sure.
Yeah.
My question is more fundamental, and which has remained with me, by the way, from Hopkins time. How generalizable these findings, reaching movement findings are? For example, that quote that you said about the practice, space practice, but the vocabulary, that means that is for cognitive learning. These are only purely for motor learning. Is it really motor learning findings generalizable to cognitive learning? Then-
Right. Well, sure. So, I mean, without doing really careful studies, I mean, so I'm not going to be able to make any claim about that at all, right? And so, we don't know. And so the other thing is that, important in the sort of, really important in the basic sort of thing that was sort of fundamental to the development of the theories in the first part was the idea that the error drives performance, right? And so for motor learning, error is a really sort of tangible thing that we have a lot of information that they drive learning, right? For cognitive things, it's not even clear what the analogy to a motor error would be, right? And so we don't know, right? It's intriguing that that there are, so Eric Kandel, who's a Nobel Prize winner from Columbia, who's famous for basically doing sort of pioneering studies on sort of the genetic basis of learning memories for people with 5 single genes, important things there. And he's did most of his studies on Plizia, which is a sea snail, a really simple person you can get at. And so he wrote this review in Journal of Neuroscience a few years ago now. And we sort of went through, and so early on, of course, people gave him a lot of hard time. Why the heck he was studying a snail, right? If you want to try to learn something about humans. And his arguments, I think, are sort of profound, but obviously need to take with some caution. That there are really lots of seemingly really interesting features of learning memory that are preserved across lots of different scales and in lots of different sort of systems, right? So one I talk about savings here, right? That when you relearn something, it's faster, right? There are other things called interference, proactive interference, retrograde interference, and there's adaptations and lots of other features that really do seem to be present in lots of different sort of learning memory preparations, right? So it's attractive to think that that there's commonalities, but it's just really attractive to think unless you show them, right? And so unfortunately, I think so far we don't have really good bridging work, right? And so the main answer to the question is no, we don't know. We definitely don't know that this is what's going on, right? But the power of having computational models, even if they're simple and they're likely not to be exactly true, is they can maybe make predictions, right? And so in the first part we made a prediction, not just what was going to happen to the learning at 24 hours later, but what we would expect to see just 60 seconds later, and how much error, the pattern of error should be like, right? And so it is, we go and look for these things and we see to what extent that they matter. For I wouldn't even go as far as cognitive things, but just for sort of more complex motor skills, right? That might be more relevant to people's actual activities.
Well, my next question, which I to discuss, was also in relation to that these reaching movements are not natural, real, physical movements. To what extent we can generalize our findings? For example, the thing that I was thinking about was retention of the learning. It seemed to me that based on the results, you never have 100% retention, or at least as long as I
Yeah.
from the studies, we never had 100% retention by reaching movement experiments. But in physical, real life motor learning experiments, we do achieve 100% retention in motor memories too. For example, like biking. If you learn it at early childhood and then don't do biking for, let's say, 20 years, after 20 years, I believe still it is retained almost 100%. So it is.
Right. So I think that, and I probably disagree with you there a little bit, right? So it's certainly true that if you learn to ride a bike, I mean, the old saying, never forget how to ride a bicycle, right? But there's really a plethora of studies that have in motor learning that have shown really clear sort of retention deficits, right? That come back really quickly, right, during training. So there's even forgetting the name for it now. There's a name that's been given that never understand, right? So the idea is that if you practice something, you go away, then immediately afterwards, right? You're very poor at retention. You're not, well, somewhat poor, right? But just 2 or 3 training trials, and you're back in the saddle, right? So something like riding a bike, it's sort of a little dangerous to talk about it because, so if you're going to say, riding a bike is just about making sure you don't fall off, right? Keeping maintaining balance, right? And there's a sort of like a big sort of ceiling effect there, right? That there's certainly a big range of ability to sort of balance, accurately, right? Where you're not going to fall off the bike, right? And so there's a sort of discreteness to how you look at things, and if you look at some more concise measure, like instead of are you staying on the bike versus going down, if you tell someone to try to ride as straight and precisely as possible, and then have some sense of measure and see how much wobble there is, right, in the ride, right? Then I think you're much more likely to see something, right? Now, the other thing, though, that's important is that these big retention deficits, so these are novel tasks, right? So people are just learning, right? And so with more and more practice, right, even this sort of simple forceful task, which you say is in a terrible methodological way, the retention gets better and better and better, right? And so the level of performance that we're comfortable with saying we're going to ride a bike, right, sort of much farther along the learning curve, right, than this. And so there is that once you achieve, once you really overtrained on something, then you're really retaining it and it goes like that. Yeah.
What is the physiological basis for the different time intervals having different effects? Time intervals.
Oh, how could that be? Yeah. So no. But things like this have been things like this have been loosely found in cognitive working memories, right? And so the prevailing idea is that they're in general the main way that we think of the brain sort of forms memories and holds on to information is by synaptic plasticity, right? So you can change the strength of synapses. But that takes some time to happen, and can't really explain sort of immediate working memories, right? And it's thought that working memories are instead maintained by sort of persistent neural activity, right? Cells firing in a certain pattern and maybe some sort of recurrent loop that sort of maintains these things. And so the idea is that this is probably due to some sort of persistent sort of maintenance of cell activity, right? So neural firing rates, right? That the case time.
According to the fact that your experiments had more than 100 trials, how did you control for fatigue effect in the movements? Fatigue effects.
Oh, well, 100 trials is really not a lot for the kind of stuff we do. So 100 trials of the force field task is probably 5 minutes of practice at a pretty leisurely pace, right? So it's, you work it out. So what I was saying is, so these movements we're doing is having people reach out and backwards. And what I was actually calling a trial is just movements just in one direction, because it turns out that there's not very much transfer of learning from one direction to the other. And so we have people, these movements themselves only take about half a second or so to make. So the average movement is 500 milliseconds long. And then the interval between an out movement and a back movement is an average of 2.5 or 3 seconds. So when you're making a movement, then you're resting for like 4 times as long as the movement was when you're making that movement. And then your arms supported. So people really don't have too much fatigue here. And then the levels of forces that people are pushing on, they're like single-digit newtons of forces. There's nothing close to like the maximum force that you can produce. And so the fatigue we have that we fight more is mental fatigue, where we get bored to death. This sort of innate task is
And also, did you have any exclusion criteria for muscle strength? I think that maybe some of the variability in the subject result can be attributed to, the variability in the muscle strength.
Yeah, so we told you have an exclusion criteria. So we have, there's so maybe we should look at that and see how it relates. But we didn't exclude anyone. Certainly, there's huge variability in muscle strength, right? So you have some, some 100-pound, woman or some football player who's just 250 pounds or something, right? Doing a task, and obviously the arm muscle strength is very, very different, right? Anecdotally, there's not, it's not so deterministic, right? So anecdotally, there's no really large effect, but we haven't looked at it systematically, right? We do like keep notes on height, weight of subjects.
My last question, you showed that variability is essential for learning. According to a number of research, Alzheimer's disease patients also show more variability in motor learning tasks than healthy older adults. So what do you think about this? Do you see a relation between?
Yeah, so, it's complicated, right? So, obviously it's possible so we showed this in healthy, healthy young people, right? And, but specifically we showed that there was variability that was specifically aligned, right, to a particular task, right? And so, it's possible that there's some disease process that, both causes, increased variability and also causes, decreased learning. If you were to take the number of neurons in some area and decimate it as you had atrophy and Alzheimer's disease, well, that would certainly cause decreased learning ability, and it would cause increased variability because you're sort of, less sort of strengthened numbers, right? And so you could certainly imagine things, not too hard, right, that would tend to destroy this relationship, right? And so there's definitely no claim that this, matters, that this is true, hell or high water, regardless of what your neurologic impairment is, right? The other thing is that, it's possible people have, haven't looked, as carefully at this variability as perhaps you could have in neurologic diseases, right? We showed that the specific type, specific sort of, temporal structure of variability, and so it's possible that the decreased learning, might partially come because the variability is sort of aberrant in its temporal structure, right? And so if that was true, then, this is one of the things we sort of haven't actually dived into, but it's just a basic idea, that, maybe what you could do is measure, like, the pattern, if there was, if it were true, this is a bunch of ifs, okay, but if it were true that people with some specific neurologic disease, relatively early on, have impaired learning, right, and they have impaired variability, right, but the variability is impaired such that it has a different structure than what healthy people have, right? Then maybe what you could do is design sort of training procedures that was aligned with the type of variability they had, right? Maybe they would be good at learning that, right? Either this overall for the group or for some individual person, right? So there's a pie in the sky idea that maybe you could actually sort of tailor learning to this, right? Whether or not that actually holds out, I have no idea. It's just pure speculation.
So you looked at retention testing as a measure of learning for your task. Have you looked at transfer testing as well to look at what would happen if you either change the parameters of the force field or if you actually took them out of a force constrained situation?
Yeah, so a lot of the stuff that I'm actually really interested in is we loosely think of it as transfer, right? And so the word that I like to use for it is we're using sort of my little research community, is generalization of learning, right? So the idea is that, you know, certainly in any particular any particular exemplar, right, that you might learn from, there are certain conditions. There are conditions that under which a movement happens, right? And so you make a movement, and it was under certain conditions, right? A certain velocity of your motion, a certain, that might think is important for this. There's certain other things, the phase of the moon, the temperature, that's probably not that important, right? And you're never going to exactly repeat that set of conditions, right? Even if you take a small subset of learning, right? And so you think of sort of learning as being some sort of neighborhood, right? Around the learning is going to be strongest, presumably, if you were exactly to repeat all the conditions, right? And then as you step away from that situation, right, the learning is going to decrease, right? And then for the relevant parameters, right, learning might decrease rapidly, right? And the irrelevant ones, like the phase of the moon, it won't matter if you step far away, right? And so we studied that a lot. And so this simple experimentally, what we often study is transfer across movement directions. So you can train something in one movement direction, look how it transfers across other movements. There's other things. We also study across speeds. We don't study the phase of the movement. And so there's definitely interesting things to be had there too. Nothing directly relevant to the story, but I'll talk to you about.
And I just had one other observation, I guess, really. I don't even know if it's a question. It's in the community of motor learning that I work with, we talk about the contextual interference effect, where we look at changing the parameters of the acquisition conditions, trying to make practice seem inherently more difficult or inherently more easy. And that all goes back to Shea and Morgan in 1979. And I can't help but draw parallels to the kind of thing that you're doing with intertrial interval.
Mm-hmm.
It seems that as you have a longer intertrial interval, there's a longer window of time which allows for forgetting before that next trial occurs. But when you have a shorter intertrial interval, there seems to be less time for forgetting before that next trial occurs, and that seems to directly parallel the contextual interference effect.
Right. So yeah, like this finding of the spacing. We did this experiment and we looked at these intermediate things. Like the finding that longer intertrial intervals lead to worse and slower learning. Like I didn't mean to say that was new or anything. Like people know about that for a while. And so and so we replicated that only, right? And so in our contribution is to say it's specifically because of this decay or this process or whatever. But there are other things going on, right? Like, yes, because this process decayed, then your performance is worse and it seemed harder for you, right? So that could be contributing too, right? We see this sort of parallel between the amount we predict and we have, but that's just relative, right? And so, we don't know everything that's contributing.
Hey folks, Dr. Smith